Hello, everybody. It's good to be back and talking about Revelation again. I'll remind you that I'll be talking about Revelation this week, and this will be the second time I've talked about Revelation. And then I'll also talk about Revelation again next week before we move on in the book a little bit farther. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I am preaching through Revelation right now, and I do want you to have a good idea of how Revelation communicates. And also some of the historical background information that's really pertinent to understanding what is going on there. So let me offer this quick review. And then basically all I want to talk about today is mostly about the churches, the seven churches in chapters 2 and 3, but also want to talk about the tribulation that is going on at that time, so we can talk about, so we can have a firm understanding of the background, let's put it that way, for much of this writing. So real quick about Revelation. First, it is an apocalyptic style of writing. Now, here's the interesting part about that, and I want to talk about this style of writing more next week. But for the book of Revelation itself, chapters 4 through 22 display the most apocalyptic style of writing. There is apocalyptic style in chapter 1, but it's not what I would say full-blown apocalyptic style of writing. We do have, it's an introductory section basically in chapter 1. A lot of it's introductory to information we're going to receive. Now, chapters 2 and 3, we have to be careful about assigning a full apocalyptic labeling to these chapters. And I'll talk about this more, but just understand this. These seven churches, I wouldn't take the number 7 as being symbolic of anything at this point. I'm only going to take numbers symbolically probably afterward. And I'm going to gauge it in the context of even some of the writing in the churches itself. So I'm going to be very, very cautious about the way that I look at some of the information presented to these churches themselves. Now, after we get to chapter 4, and all the way through 22, basically we are in what I would consider a fully implemented apocalyptic style of writing. At that point, we can change gears, or we can progress a little bit farther into this apocalyptic style of writing and trying to understand how it communicates itself. So, again, I'll talk about apocalyptic writing much more next week. The book of Revelation itself is set in the 1st century. So we're not saying there's no 20th century view in there or anything else to that respect. It is the 1st century. The backdrop is the Roman Empire. Christianity is struggling within this setting itself. So it's the Roman Empire and Christianity within this, and the struggle that is beginning. When we have Revelation, we're at the beginning point of this animosity that will be apparent between the Roman Empire and Christianity itself. The enemy is the Roman Empire. Now, Satan can use these governmental entities. In fact, he can use anything. God is not protecting any government. God is only protecting the church in this world. So yes, governments are fair game for Satan. There's no doubt about it. They can use that against Christianity. Christianity is not supposed to combat. We're supposed to just be submissive. However, in Revelation 13 and 14, when we get there, there's a far different messaging coming out for Christians at that point. At that point, real quick, at that point, government, the Roman Empire, has become totally enamored with itself, let's put it that way, and I'll explain this in the culture itself, but what ends up happening is that many people begin to worship the Roman emperor as a god. So we have this imperial worship, or the worship of the emperor, in the writing of Revelation itself, and it does come out. And the enemy is the Roman Empire. So Satan can use these forces against Christianity, but again, God is protecting His church. That's the only thing God is protecting in this world, and the only thing God is working through is through His church. He's not working through any countries. In fact, God has the same view of an African as He does American, as a Russian, as a Brazilian, as a Chinese person, and a Mexican. God views those people the same. He has no partiality to people. He says that in Acts, and also Peter relays this again in First Peter itself. But But God does have a fondness. In fact, the church is his treasure. I've talked about this many, many times, and it is represented that way in the New Testament, especially in the letter of Ephesians. God is protecting, God is cherishing, God is caring for his church, and he will continue to do so. But there are harsh warnings to these churches in chapter 7. Now, real quick about the Roman Empire, just to give you a little bit more history about it. It's kind of something I find very interesting about how the Roman Empire comes to an end. If you're not aware of this, so in Revelation we have the Roman Empire is directly confronting, or they are against the Christianity, against the church. This will only increase as time progresses. So by the time we get to the beginning of the 4th century, it is very hostile towards Christianity. But at the same time, right after this, there's a big change that happens in the Roman Empire. 326, Constantine is able to conquer Rome, and he sets himself up as emperor. He claims to have had a vision of a cross in the sky. In fact, so his soldiers display this cross symbol on their shields and on some of their uniform. But anyway, Constantine, because of his conviction about this action by God, which is skeptical, truthfully, most people don't think it actually occurred this way, that he was using religion as a way to grab power, which was probably true. But here's the interesting thing about Constantine is that after he comes into power in the Roman Empire, now this is towards the first quarter of the 4th century. So we're talking around 325 to 330. What he does is he implements Christianity as the state religion. Now, prior to that, Christianity, the Roman Empire was dead set against Christianity. There was great angst against Christianity, animosity. They were openly persecuting, killing Christians at that time. But after Constantine, Christianity becomes the state religion. Let me say that again. Christianity becomes the state religion, and any kind of pagan religion is outlawed. Now, what we discover in Revelation, I'm going to come back to the Roman Empire, is that the Roman Empire, as the backdrop, will be destroyed. They will be destroyed. But they're not destroyed until completely until the beginning of the 6th century. The middle of the 5th century, they begin to wither from the onslaught of the Germanic tribes. But by 510, at the beginning of the 6th century, basically the Roman Empire is over. It's done. You have the Eastern Empire that continues, but the Western Empire, Rome, is gone. Now, the reason why I bring that up is because prior to that, 125 years earlier, before they began to wither and die and finally were completely eradicated, which happens, a few decades later, is that the Roman Empire was fully Christian. Now, there were some times that an emperor might come into play and try to turn them away from Christianity, but it didn't happen. The Roman Empire was basically a state religion, and under Constantine, Christianity was a state religion, and everything else was outlawed. So if you were worshiping something else, you could be imprisoned or persecuted, as the Christians were prior to this. But their turnaround did not save them. They were destroyed by God, as he says he will do in Revelation. Again, God is not working through any country. God is only working through his church. He will save his church. Countries come and go. They will, and it will continue that way until the end of time. But the church will stand. Now, we're going to talk about these churches, and there's some warnings in here for these churches. So we have to understand that the church must remain faithful and sound. So faithful to God and sound in their doctrine in order for them to continue to have this protective, caring presence of God with them. Now, let me talk about the tribulation real quick. So in chapter 1, verse 9, if you don't know the Greek, you need to look at several different translations. So in there, he talks about, and if you look at the New American Standard or the English Standard Version, it'll bring it up, that John says that he is a partaker in the tribulation. Now, what happened is the 1984 version of the NIV, the New International Version, which had numerous problems. It was not a very good translation. And people clamored for it because basically they had the King James or the NIV, and that was about it. The New American Standard was there, but for some reason no one gravitated towards it, but they gravitated towards the NIV. And the NIV at that time was not a very good translation. Now, it has improved 2011 edition is a very good translation, but the 1984 is not. And in the 1984 translation of the Greek word there in chapter 1, verse 9, instead of tribulation, they put suffering. And so they had to have done that by a choice. Now, this is the time, you're coming out of the 70s with Hal Lindsey. You have this great dispensational movement that's starting to grab a hold of some of these lay leaders. Again, this is not an academic pursuit of understanding Revelation. This is coming from lay people that lack a lot of ability to really to discern the information well. And if the NIV may have not translated that as suffering, it may have helped out a lot of people and not got them started down the wrong path. Now, I think the NIV made a choice here. I don't know why, what the discussion was or anything like that, but the word that's used there, thlipsis in Greek, should be translated as oppression or tribulation. That is really the only way to understand this. There are other words for suffering. This is not a word that's used generally for suffering, though it can depict suffering. But it is the word for difficult times, or tribulation, or oppression. And what John tells us, at that time, in the first century, he is in the tribulation. In fact, he says, I am a participant in this tribulation. He also says he's a participant in the kingdom of God, and he's also a participant in the enduring nature that Christians have to have. We have to endure in our loyalty and faithfulness to God. We have to persevere. So, again, if the NIV had not gotten some people off track, we probably wouldn't be having to come back and try to clean up some of this mess that's been laid down by others. But coming back to this, chapter 1, verse 9, John tells us very clearly that he is a fellow participant in the tribulation. It is going on at that time. Now, any astute New Testament reader would know that, hey, that fits into the logic and what Jesus has basically taught us. He taught us that in the Gospel of John, chapter 15, and you can go, well, actually, that whole discourse, 14, 15, 16, is all just a great exposition as Jesus is teaching his disciples and preparing them for his departure. He tells them very specifically in John 15 that they're going to have trouble. People did not like Jesus, he says, and they will not like you also. There will always be some kind of difficulty going on for Christians. Now, there is another problem that's going to come up in Revelation, and it's a problem that's affecting the churches. Not only is persecution part of the problem, but some churches are being seduced. In fact, we have this seduction idea that's coming up, and will come up, and it'll be very apparent in chapter 18 and 19 of 17, 18, and into 19 of Revelation. And what I mean by seduction is that there are actually some Christians out there in this setting in Revelation who think that they can apply the label of Christian to themselves, have the veneer of Christianity upon them, but their values are not Christian values. They long for wealth. They long for power. They long for what the secular world can give them. They long for what the Roman Empire will give them. And when the Roman Empire comes to an end, the picture is that they weep because of this. And God tells them, get out of her, my people. So if you're even caught into this quicksand of ideology, thinking that you can somehow juggle Christianity and worldly values at the same time, you're not going to survive. You must get out of that kind of environment. And so some people are being seduced. And actually, I think seduction is probably much more dangerous than persecution. I think seduction is what is exactly going on in America today, especially since around the 1980s when Christianity is really starting to take a steep decline in the United States. People have been seduced into thinking that they can incorporate worldly values into their Christian practices, and it's not. Christians are only supposed to look to the New Testament for our guidance. We live in this world, but we're not a part of this world. That's not what we are. We are, as Peter says in 1 Peter, we're just aliens and sojourners. We're just passing through. Our home is with the Lord, and so this is not our final residence. Our residence is to be with God always. So some people are being seduced by worldly values, and it's pulling them away from God. They don't recognize it because they've been duped. into thinking that these values that they espouse somehow fit also within New Testament values, are congruent with New Testament values, and they are not. They have been seduced and pulled away. And some of the churches are experiencing that. Laodicea is one of the churches that's been seduced. Some of these others, Thyatira and Sardis, are also being seduced. Now they're experiencing false teaching, but they are being seduced in a different way with false teaching. And we'll talk about that here and I get to these churches. Now, these churches, real quick, there are 7 listed. I don't think the number 7 means anything. I think it just is an understanding of a number of 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 churches. Why 7? I don't know. Why didn't he include 8? He very well could have. He could have put Colossae in here very easily. Colossae is only, I think, 11 miles away from Laodicea. So there are other churches that John could have included, and why he does not, I'm not sure. But it seems that some of the writings in the New Testament seem to be devoted to this area. In fact, I think the letter of Ephesians is basically a circular letter meant to go to many of these churches in Asia Minor. This area of Asia Minor, real quick, what I'm talking about, where these 7 churches are located, it's in modern-day Turkey. In your Bible, it will be called Asia Minor. It is the western side of Turkey, is what we're talking about. In fact, the western side of Turkey is where early Christianity really got its boom, started going, and then, well, partially north up in Lebanon and places like that too. But that western part of Turkey is really where a lot of action is going on for early Christianity. Now, these are 7 historical churches. We know that Ephesus, we know about Ephesus. In fact, the letter of Ephesians would have went through Ephesus and other cities. It was a circular letter, but Ephesus would have seen that letter. 1 Timothy was written to Timothy while he's in Ephesus. 1 John very well could be Ephesus. It may be Antioch. But the point is that Ephesus was a major center for early Christianity. In fact, there's 4 areas that basically are major centers for early Christianity. You have Ephesus, you have Alexandria, Egypt, you have Antioch of Syria, and then you have Rome itself, which is starting to emerge. But these are historical churches. Now, Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer, really got us off track when he started to try to mirror these churches with eras of church history, saying that this church that's represented in Revelation, we'll just say Ephesus, seems to be a reflection of the early church from the 1st century to the 4th century. And they just kept on going down the line and applied historical periods and labeled each church as reflective of a certain historical period. He got us way off track. That is not what's going on here. Luther didn't have a clue on this. I don't know why he even proposed this. A lot of it was because of his angst and bias. He had an extreme bias against the Roman Catholic Church. It blinded him in so many ways. He was also an anti-Semite. So, I take what Luther says many times, I take with a grain of salt. But he got us off track thinking that these 7 churches mirrored historical periods of early Christianity and up to medieval and into modern Christianity. So he was wrong at that point. These are 7 historical churches. They sit on the western side of modern-day Turkey, and in the Bible it's called Asia Minor. Now, about imperial worship, I wanted to come back to this. So this area of Asia Minor is it's the hotbed. It's where the practice of imperial worship is happening the most. Now, they are a part of the Roman Empire, but they don't have the elite status. So Asia Minor doesn't have the status of, say, a Rome, for one thing, or a Corinth, or some of these other places that have higher standings within the Roman Empire itself. Asia Minor wants to be viewed with a higher status. They want to be more important in the Roman Empire. So they adopt practices that would be flattering to people in charge. And one of those practices is they begin to worship the emperor as a god. Now, this is not new. This is not new, and it's not a power play or anything like that. Most cultures did worship their kings as a type of god. Even in the Psalms, we have the ancient Israelites doing this with their kings. So ancient people just did not have a firm understanding of humanity and divinity and the differences. They're struggling to understand. God's only giving them pieces of information as they progress. He can only give them what they can understand at a moment, and then he can move from there. So we have ancient people, ancient Israelite people who thought like this too. So it's not abnormal. It's perfectly normal. Now, many Roman emperors, because of Greek philosophy and being influenced by Greek philosophy, did not want to be thought of as a god. In fact, they consider themselves not to be a god. So Augustus is a good example. He didn't view himself as a god, but he did not dissuade other people from doing that to him, though. So he liked the idea of other people worshiping him as a god, but he did not think of himself as a god himself. It was a good way to keep people under control. Now, other emperors like Vespasian. Vespasian was a really good guy. He did not think of himself as a god. He thought himself as a normal human. And he did not encourage. In fact, he discouraged imperial worship. Now, the person that's in charge now is Domitian. So we don't have Vespasian here. Domitian is actually the grandson of or the son of Vespasian, younger son of Vespasian. Domitian probably is desiring to be worshipped. All we know for sure is that in Asia Minor during this time, this is where these 7 churches reside, this is a hotbed for imperial worship. They're not doing it in Rome, because in Rome they're more basic oriented. They already have the status of being the key city in the empire, so they're more grounded in their laws, and more grounded in their order, some of the other things. They have a more grounded view of humanity. But places outside of Rome, and places that are wanting to increase their status, the favorable status within the Roman Empire, are doing certain things in order to flatter people. And this is a place where they're definitely worshiping the emperor as a god. This will be important when we get in chapters 13 and 14. Now, these churches. So, for these 7 churches, there are words of encouragement for some of them. Some of them receive severe warnings, very severe. And then some of them, all of them have some kind of a call to action. So, now, of the 5 churches that are mentioned here, or the 7 churches, of the 7 churches mentioned here, John says 5 of those churches need to repent. 5 churches need to repent. They're going the wrong way. They need to turn back toward God, is what the idea is. Now, the language is very harsh for these churches, but it's especially harsh for Ephesus. So the first church mentioned is Ephesus. Now, Ephesus was an early Christian center. Paul spent more time in Ephesus than he did anywhere else, a little over 3 years, if I've calculated from Acts correctly. And it was a place that he spent a lot of time at, and probably a lot of these churches that are referenced within chapters 2 and 3, and others, probably were initiated from this Ephesian ministry that Paul had. However, at this point, and this would be about 30 years after the death of Paul, something tragically has happened to this church. I'll deal with this more when I preach about these churches coming up. But Ephesus receives one of the sternest warnings. And what Jesus says to them is if they don't get things turned around, he tells them to repent. If they don't get things turned around, he is going to pull his presence from them. So it's a stern warning. Now, I've stated before that the church will always be around, and it will. There will always be a faithful group of people to God. We know that from Isaiah, the remnant idea. It's important in Romans 9 and 11. It's talking about Israelite Jewish people there being a remnant that were always faithful to God, but I think the principle still applies. There will always be faithful people to God, Christians. However, there are going to be some churches that go off track. I think this is what's going on in so many places in the United States. It's going completely off track. And God is not going to stop it. he's going to let them go. He warns them, turn it around. But if you don't turn it around, my presence will not be with you. And when God's presence leaves, that means his protection also leaves. His guidance leaves. His wisdom leaves. Everything that we would think about, positive things that God can infuse into a church, gone. Gone. If they don't get things turned around. Now that's for Ephesus. Stern warning. Laodicea has a very stern warning also. In fact, Jesus invites them to come and fellowship with him so they can get some things turned around. So the church in Ephesus and the church in Laodicea received the sternest warnings. We have 3 churches that are doing poorly also, and they're being plagued by false teaching. So we have Pergamum, which seems to be battling against Judaism. So you remember the forces of Judaism were often, they caused a lot of trouble for early Christianity. Paul fought these Judaizers over and over. We have the problems in Galatia. We have the problems in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. He's anticipating these problems in Romans. He talks about his battles in Philippians and in Ephesians. So he fought this false ideology for a long, long time. So what do I mean by Judaizers? A Judaizer is a person, a Jewish person, who thinks you need to follow the Old Covenant or most of the practices of the Old Covenant in order to be a Christian. They do not realize, or they have not accepted, that the Old Covenant is over and a new covenant has come. Now, Thyatira is another church that's mentioned here. It seems to be battling syncretism. This is where we're starting to have worldly values being incorporated into churches. So Thyatira is not in a very good position either. And we have mention of the Nicolaitans and Balaam and Balak there. The next church is Sardis, and we have this metaphor of Jezebel. Again, another false teacher. We have syncretism. What I mean by that is people are incorporating some kind of pagan practices into religious practices, probably to keep governmental officials off their back, maybe people in the community that are influential that are worshiping these other pagan, participating in these pagan practices. Anyway, they're trying to, in their mind, shield the church by incorporating some of these to appease people. And God is not pleased at all that this happens. And he tells them, you need to get things turned around. This is false teaching. Now, there are 2 churches that are doing very well, but they need encouragement. So Smyrna is one of them. Now, Smyrna seems to have a lack of confidence. They don't think they're doing very well, but God tells them they are doing very well. He encourages them to stay on the course. Philadelphia is another church that is doing very well. And again, God encourages them to stay on the course. Now, each of these churches, at the very beginning, it's addressed to an angel, to the church. I wish they never would have translated this as angel. It really gets confusing. The word itself is angelos in Greek. That's where we get angel from, okay? The word can just mean messenger. It doesn't have to have anything to do with a heavenly being. Now, it is true that in Platonic thought, from the Greek philosopher Plato, which was influencing most people at this time, there was a view that there was an ideal situation in the spiritual realm or the heavenly realms, and that there was a non-ideal mirror of that in the physical world. So yes, in Platonic thought, there were probably some people who thought we have a physical church worshiping, and then there's a reflection of that, a true church in the spiritual realm. That is Platonic thought. However, I don't think Platonic thought is what is going on here. Even though we're going to have many visions about things going on in heaven itself, but when we get those images of what's going on in heaven, it seems to be a reflection of past the end of time. So the final judgments happened, and people are living with God in bliss, as God promises. And they're living an everlasting life, as God promises. So it seems to be after that point that we're talking about so many of these things. So the angel, I think, would probably be, if we just translate it as messenger, I think it would be better. I actually think John is saying, hey, the person who's teaching for you guys every week or preaching or whatever, that's the messenger. Tell that person that if they don't get some things straightened out, this church is going to dissolve itself. Now, there is also a view in Platonic thought, and this comes from Daniel. We see it in Daniel, that there were spiritual forces that protected churches, as if there was an angel protecting this church. I don't think that's what's going on here either, because there is no idea about this protector also being an instructor when we start to look at these models. So again, I do think if we just translate that to the messenger of such and such church, basically in common terms, we just say that person was probably the preacher or the preaching elder that's talked about in 1 Timothy 5:18. The elder who preaches and teaches is worthy of double honor. So that person is probably what it's talking about. So let me sum up real quick. John says that he is in the tribulation, so difficulty is going on at that time. Jesus warned us that there'll be difficulty from his death until his return. In this span of last time, we are going to be in these difficult days. Now, it doesn't always have to be persecution. It can also be seduction. Seduction is, I think, more dangerous than persecution. Persecution, hey, I'm being beaten in prison because of where I stand at with my values. Seduction, somebody's pulling you away from God and you don't even realize it's going on. You think everything's all right, and before you know it, you're completely separated from God because you have followed worldly values, pursued those, whatever else. You have sought something besides following God. So, those two things, these 7 churches are real churches in Asia Minor, historical churches. That doesn't mean that the message isn't for other churches also. It just means that John, the one that wrote this, is associated with these churches, and he's providing pastoral guidance for them. Now, next week I'm going to come back to Revelation again. I want to talk about the style of writing. I'm going to come back to that and give you some key details about each part of that style of writing, and talk about parts in Revelation that reflect in greater detail these certain parts of the apocalyptic style of writing. So I will be back next week, and I'll see you all on Sunday. Have a great Thursday. Bye.